And I am going to go to a share screen. And I trust that you can see, and I'm going to go from the beginning. So this is always my double check. Can everybody see now? Just full screen. Taste number 2, Jewish literacy, and I can't.
Yes.
I can't see you all, so you will have to jump in and let me know if there's an issue.
We can see it.
Okay, thank you. And I'm trying to get a group view. Whoops. Hold on one second. Huh. Show. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. So I can at least see some of you. Okay. So again, as always, I want to point out that on my website, I have copies of these slides, and also on the website, on kind of the main classes page, you will see links to recordings of these classes. It'll take me a day or two to get this recording on the website because I'm not home at the moment. So here we are in Torah, selected text, and additional materials. So many of you will be very familiar with this idea. It's something I talk about all the time, and specifically in the science and religion class that I completed a while ago. I always say, in my way of looking at it, and I want to emphasize this isn't necessarily the Jewish way of looking at it. It is certainly a Jewish way of looking at it. But in my way of looking at Torah, and actually I want to back up. Well, no, okay, let me go ahead. In my way of looking at the question of religious faith, I think of 2 leaps of faith. Leap of faith number 1 is there a God? And for purposes of that leap of faith, I mean by God an intelligence behind the creation of the universe, an organizing intelligence. It's a subject of a separate course. On that subject, I believe there is tremendous evidence, but which is conclusive for me, it convinces me, but there are bright people in the world who, looking at the same evidence, would come to a different conclusion, that there is an organizing intelligence. And so I will describe that as there's lots of evidence from physics and from the world about the existence of God, but I would not describe it as proof. That's leap of faith number 1. Leap of faith number 2 is, does God care? And I usually describe it in these 2 very different ways. Does God care whether I have turkey or ham for dinner tonight? Does God care whether I am kind to people or torture people or torture babies? That if you accept the idea, or even just want to pursue the idea that God cares, for me, once again, if God cares, to me, it's a logical and inescapable conclusion that God would convey God's caring. And for most religions, there is some kind of scripture, there's some kind of divine communication between humanity and God. For Jews, this is Torah, which you will see in a moment is a term which is broader than just the 5 books of Moses. And so, and Torah, of course, is the subject for this evening. So I want to just say a lot of things about Torah. For one thing, it's written in Hebrew. And Hebrew, as most of us know that have studied Hebrew at all, Hebrew is written from right to left. And I came across, and actually what you're seeing on the screen is an example of ancient Hebrew, which doesn't look anything like modern Hebrew. This actually is a stela, an inscription from Tel Dan. It's actually a place where I personally was involved in some of the excavation, and it's the only mention of David outside of biblical sources. And some scholars believe it's easier for a right-handed chiseler, if you're inscribing in stone or in clay, to go from right to left than from left to right, for the same reason why for us right-handed folks, it's easier to write with pen and ink in the other direction. And that may well be the reason that some of the ancient languages, certainly Hebrew and Aramaic and Babylonian and Arabic, are all written from right to left. Hebrew in the context of ancient Hebrew, all the biblical texts, the Torah, really anything that's more than 1,000 years old, roughly speaking,
Where are you going?
Is written without vowels. And so that can sound intimidating, but it has a couple of interesting aspects. It forces us to read words in their context. So for example, suppose I gave you the letters H and T in English, and I said, you can put whatever vowels you want in those two letters, in front of them, between them, after them. It would be very ambiguous. It could be hat, hot, hit, hut, heat, hate, and so on. Presumably from context, it would be clear which word you're referring to. But there are some notable examples where the context is not clear. And the other interesting thing, we'll get to this in a second, is Hebrew is a wonderfully ambiguous language. There aren't that many words in Hebrew, particularly in biblical Hebrew. And so each word has a wide range of meaning. And that has a great influence on both Hebrew and on Judaism and on Christianity. So this is what text would look like, both in ancient times and in a Torah scroll. So this is the opening of the Bible. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz v'haaretz hayta tohu v'vohu v'choshech al pnei tehom v'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim, and so on. No vowels, because I happen to know this section. I can read it pretty fluently, but probably so could a first or second grader in Israel, because it's just not that difficult to read. Now, this is I think a very important and foundational point. Judaism understands revelation as being infinitely deep in meaning. So everything has meaning. So it's not just simply translating it and interpreting it. And you'll see some interesting quotes on that in a minute, but everything has meaning. This is like a love letter from God, and we study it over and over again, and we read through it. We go through the entire text once a year, and we read through it and read through it to look for the deeper and deeper meanings in the text. So I want to just give you some examples of that. So one of the questions is, why does the Torah begin with the Hebrew letter bet? Again, if it's just if you asked that of Shakespeare, why did you begin with this word? The answer might be, well, that was the word I began with. But the rabbis, the interpreters, would never be satisfied with that. They're going to look for deeper meanings. So they're going to say, backing up, look at the shape of the letter bet here. The letter bet is closed above, closed to the right, and closed below. So the secret meaning of this, choosing this first letter, is that you can't know anything in the universe except Torah. And the letter bet is open on this side. So all meaning and all wisdom is going to flow into this direction, into the revelation of Torah. Another reason to begin with the letter bet, the bet is the second letter. Okay, so again, a bunch of noise.
It's a really bad idea that you set the precedent, and that if he does both, because they still haven't decided to work from home allowance.
You guys all hear that?
He really will screw me if I have to replace him once we start shooting. We only have 8 weeks of shooting.
I am going to mute
week 1 or 2, I'm screwed.
Okay, so I've just muted everyone, so now you have to unmute yourself if you want to talk, and you can certainly do that. So why begin with this letter? Letter bet is the second letter of the Torah, and it has a numerical value 2. And so one of the lessons, which again we're going to see by beginning with letter bet, is to reveal that there are 2 Torahs. And Jewish tradition teaches that when Moses was on Mount Sinai, he received 2 revelations. One was a written Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, with the instructions, write this down. And he dutifully wrote that down. The second Torah was an oral Torah, and we'll see that in a second, with the instructions, never ever write this down. And as you'll see in a moment, that's what becomes the Mishnah and the Talmud. But I have a lot more to say about that. But my real point is we're deriving all of that simply from one letter. So the other issue, remember I talked about the ambiguity of the text. The first two words of the Hebrew Bible present a grammatical problem. They read Bereshit bara Elohim, which is often translated as in the beginning God created. It's sometimes translated as in the beginning of God's creation, but none of those are right. In fact, nothing is right because there's an error. If we wanted to say in the beginning God created instead of Bereshit, we would say Berishonah. Bereshit is half of an expression. Hebrew grammar requires the next word to be a noun, but the word following Bereshit, I'll do it in the Hebrew here, this word is a verb. It means create, he created, and it's actually bara is an interesting word. It only applies to God's creation. When a man creates something, a different verb is used. So according to the laws of Hebrew grammar, we need a noun here, but there is no noun here. Bereshit literally means in the beginning of, and now I need a noun. So what's going on here? One possibility, if I want to take my yarmulke off and look at it as a scientific text, or in a scholarly way, there's a scribal error which somehow crept in and it was never corrected. But of course, the rabbis would never say that. This is the text that they have, and so they would say that God was trying to teach us. Just as God is teaching us something in the shape of the letter, God is calling our attention to an obvious problem. How obvious? It's between word 1 and word 2 of the text. And so what Rashi says is that God is teaching us that we can't simply translate the text, that we have to dig in and interpret. Murray, you have your hand raised.
I read somewhere a possible, well, I don't want to use the word solution, but an interpretation is if you break up the first word into two, then it reads Barashit bara Elohim, which would be more balanced.
I don't hear a difference between what you just read.
I mean, if you break up the first word into two words, and then you would have four words there, not three.
Okay.
And that it would be.
So the first word, how would you break up Bereshit? Do you recall what they said?
In half, as Barashit bara Elohim.
Oh, that's interesting. And I'm not sure.
Yeah,
what
but I'm not sure what it means.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Something to contemplate.
Yeah. So anyway, it's another way of interpreting text, which I am all for. And there's another really interesting thing. This is Kabbalistic. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, created God. The word order is strange, even in Hebrew. You would expect it to say, Barishana Elohim bara et hashamayim, but the word order is different. So some of the mystics read this as, in the beginning, God was created, or with Reshit, whatever that means, and in other places it means wisdom. With wisdom, God was created. So there's all kinds of interesting things going on here. The main point is the Jewish way of reading text is to dig for hints and clues and things we can discuss, argue about, and in some ways, some of these arguments can result in a whole other religion. And we'll see that in a way in Christianity. So here is quoting one of my favorite rabbis, Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi of Great Britain. He makes what is just a beautiful point. Every text needs interpretation. It doesn't just stand on its own. Every interpretation needs wisdom. Every wisdom needs careful negotiation between the timeless and time. And there, I think what he's saying is the text may have had a meaning, 2,500 years ago when the story gets created, but it probably it may not be the same meaning that we have today. And he says, and this I think is a crucial issue, that fundamentalism reads texts as if God were as simple as we are, and that's unlikely to be true. And in the same vein, the Talmud is quoted as saying, one who translates a verse literally is a liar. And I think there they're making the point that if you maintain that only the simple meaning is true, it's worse than just oversimplifying, you're actually lying. And this is actually the great schism that somebody raised, forgive me, I just don't recall who is it that mentioned this, with the Protestant Reformation, where they were saying, I mean, they certainly objected to the popes and the priests and so on, but one of the major innovations there was the concept of sola scriptura. So in many cases, the Protestant Reformation said, just give me the text. Don't give me all your interpretations and your readings and so on. Just give me the Bible. I will read it and interpret it on my own. I actually don't have a problem with that, except at least read it in the original. You know, read the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew and the New Testament in Greek. But of course, one of the elements of the Reformation was to translate the Bible into English. And before King James did this, or in King James' time, he didn't personally translate it, translating the Bible into English was a capital crime. You could be put to death for translating the Bible into English. And so, so certainly Judaism and Catholicism share many things, but one of the things that they share is the idea that we don't just read the Bible simply and interpret it on our own. When I read text, I want to hear what the Talmud says about it, what the ancient rabbis say about it, what the modern rabbis say about it. I want to hear what Christians say about it. I want to hear what, if the same text, I want to hear what Muslims say about the text and so on. And then, you know, kind of put them all together and try and make sense of it. So I want to get into Jewish sacred texts beyond the Bible. Many people will say, well, Judaism is the religion of the Old Testament and Christianity is a religion of the New Testament. And that is, it's not even an oversimplification, it's really not true. So let's begin with these texts on the Jewish side, and then we'll compare it with how it is understood on the Christian side as well. So in in the Hebrew Bible, we have three distinct sections. One of the names for a Hebrew Bible is Tanakh, using the letters in Hebrew that begin with Torah, prophets, Nevi'im, and writings, which is Ketuvim. So three sections of the Bible. These are the dates in which scholars say the text was written in its current form. So we have Torah 400 BCE, prophets 200 BCE. We don't say BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, year of our Lord, we say BCE, before the Common Era, and this is 90 CE, Common Era. So that's the Bible. Roughly the same books in the Hebrew Bible as in a Christian Old Testament. The Catholics and Greek Orthodox have a bunch of books called the Apocrypha, which are not in the Hebrew Bible, and that's an interesting story on its own. And when we have our, one single section later on Bible, we'll get into it. So then remember I said when Moses was on Mount Sinai, he received two revelations, a written Torah, that's this first part, and an oral Torah with the instructions never ever write it down. And then of course in the year, so this is a question I'd love to ask, and I don't know, in this format, people aren't always so willing to jump in and speculate. But what would you guess are the advantages and disadvantages of having an oral tradition that never gets written down? So I think that Bryce, you have your hand up. I don't know if it was about.
Well, I was putting my hand up because I was going to ask you what would be the reason that we would want to have a portion of it not written down. So
Okay.
I guess I was anticipating your question, and I'm wondering if it has something to do with being able to modify it as circumstance, or maybe if this is particular commentary about the writings themselves, that you might not want to reveal that to your average person, you know, in Jewish person.
Yeah. Okay. That's I've I've never heard that possibility that it was wanted to be kept secret, because children would start studying Mishnah at, I think,
But it
6 or
wasn't
7
written
years
down
old.
yet. No.
No,
But
no, but well, by the time they're studying it, it's written down. As we'll see, it gets written down in the year 200 of the Common Era.
no, I understand. But
So,
point is
right.
the reason they were told not to write it down.
So what are the advantages and disadvantages? So one advantage, I guess you could argue, is that it can be kept secret. Murray? You need to unmute yourself. Whoops. Sorry, I may have. Do it one more time. Unmute yourself.
I think some people are not muted because there's a lot of background noise.
You know, there's some background noise you may be hearing from here. Let me ask my wife to lower the TV in the other room. Hang on. Okay, sorry about that. Murray.
Yeah, I was gonna say, the first thing I believe is that like most people didn't know how to read and write back then, and the second thing I read when I was studying like Greek mythology, the Odyssey and the Iliad, basically they said, well, if it's not being spoken and heard, where is it? In other words, there was this kind of mysticism against writing. Like if it's just written down, where is it? It has to be like within a person to like be real or something.
I would say certainly when we get to Talmudic times, it is mandatory for Jewish men, boys, to be literate. In fact, in a village, you're supposed to build a school before you build a synagogue. Joey, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I would just say, or think that, you know, verbal communication is something that can probably be understood, I'd say, a little bit easier, passed down. You could be manipulated in a way where you're talking to an adult who's experienced with that text or understanding versus a child. You could put that meaning into multiple ways and they might understand it the same.
Okay.
So the teaching of it is still there and it can be passed on. And if that school or the synagogue, you know, burns to the ground or gets destroyed, it's still carried with, you know, within the people, you know, that understand it.
Okay, thank you. So let me comment. A clear disadvantage of an oral tradition is the game telephone. You know, you hand it from one person to another, to another, to another,
Yes.
and it changes. An advantage of an oral teaching is you have to discuss it. So you have to ask, as times change, you know, what does this rule mean? I'm reciting the rule by memory, but now we're in a group of rabbis and rabbinic students. People are going to say, yeah, but you know, Izzy's goat dropped dead on Shmuel's land, and I think it's because he was, you know, Shmuel didn't fence him off properly. So we have this law. How does it apply to this case? So there's advantages and disadvantages. What happens in the year 200 of the Common Era is the leading rabbi of the time, Yehuda HaNasi, decides that if he doesn't write down the oral law, it's going to be lost. And if you think about what's going on in the Jewish world at this time, there have been two unsuccessful major revolts against Rome. The so-called Great Revolt in the year 66 to 70, which results in the destruction of the temple. And then the Bar Kokhba revolt in the year 135, all Common Era now, which is brutally put down, and the Jews are expelled from Jerusalem. The land around Jerusalem is salted so nothing grows on it. And so these orderly schools of rabbis, these were memory geniuses that memorized large blocks of text, are being dispersed. And there's a fear that if we don't write it down, it's going to be lost. And by the way, one of the memory tools is to chant. So I'm going to chant you a little bit of Mishnah, in a traditional Mishnah chanting, and I bet many of you will recognize this. Anybody recognize that? Yes. Okay, so it's from the 4 questions. And by chanting songs, it's easier to remember lyrics. And here is my proof case. Now you're all muted, so I can't hear you chime in. But raise your hands if you know the next words of this sacred chant. It was an itsy bitsy teeny weeny. We remember that. I often say, I wish I could free up those brain cells in my brain that remember all of these ridiculous songs from the 60s. But that's why the tradition of chanting texts developed. Okay, so Yehuda HaNasi writes down the Mishnah and the next few hundred years in 2 separate areas. The rabbis are meeting and discussing elements of the Mishnah, and their discussions are carefully edited and combined together, and resulting in 2 Talmuds. So basically, if you have the Mishnah and its commentary, the commentary is called Gemara, you get Talmud. So in Babylon, what's up with Babylon? When the temple is first destroyed in 586 BCE, it's destroyed by the Babylonians, and the Jewish leadership is exiled to Babylon. 50 years later, King Cyrus of Persia conquers Babylon, allows the Jews to return, but most Jews are very happy to stay in Babylon, thank you very much, and they stay there. And Babylon becomes a center of Judaism for about the next 1,500 years, and it has the advantage that the Jews are not being harassed in Babylon. In the Holy Land, the Jews, as we saw, are being harassed by the Romans, and in the 4th century of the Common Era, Rome becomes Christian, and now the Jews are being harassed by the Christians, and so you don't have this as stable an environment for the orderly study of these texts. So generally speaking, if you hear somebody saying this is from the Talmud, unless they say the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, they're always talking about the Babylonian Talmud. It's more carefully edited, more organized, and more studied. So that's the basic Jewish text. And now I just want to throw up this image to show you there's a lot more. In addition to what I just showed you, we have Midrash, and we're always talking about this in our Torah study, is which elements are coming from Midrash. Midrash are rabbinic commentaries that go from the same period, from the 5th and 6th century to the 12th century, and there's still Midrash being written today, which explain gaps in the text. And then you have commentary. You have great scholars who are reading these texts, not only the Bible, but also the Talmud. So you have people like Rashi and Maimonides, and there's kind of I would say a dozen or more major commentaries written. One of the problems of the Talmud, which really one of the things the Talmud is doing, we'll see this in a little bit, is answering the question, how are we supposed to be Jewish without a temple? So it's basically going to describe what Jewish law is. And the problem is it's scattered all over the place. If you've ever studied Talmud with us, and Temple Adat Elohim has Talmud study on Saturday mornings at 8 o'clock Pacific time. You read through the commentaries, you're reading about, you have a little bit of Mishnah, and you have a rabbi commenting on that, and then that reminds the Talmud of 14 other things that rabbi liked to talk about. And so he will go off on that tangent. And inside that tangent may be a very important part of Jewish law. And unless you know the Talmud by heart, and as you'll see in a moment, it's quite voluminous, you wouldn't know where to look to find that law. So you have two key teachers here. One is Maimonides, one is Joseph Caro, who organize Jewish law topically. So what they're going to do is take all the laws relating to the Sabbath and put them in one place. All the laws relating to honoring your parents, put them in another place. All the laws relating to keeping kosher, put them in another place. And that's of great help. Meanwhile, on the side here, there is the Zohar, which is a mystical commentary on the Torah. And down here we have the Siddur, the prayer book. So there's a lot going on. That's one of the reasons why rabbinical school is 5-year full-time graduate study. And another reason is why, you know, some of us just spend our life studying this joyfully, I might add, at least in the case of yours truly. Okay, so I just want to show you some pictures of things. Many of you, if you've been to a Jewish service, a Sabbath service, a holiday service, a bar, bat mitzvah, has seen a Torah scroll. And we're going to have a session, I think, just on Torah. Torah is written on the skin of a kosher animal. It's written with a quill feather pen. It takes a scribe about a year to write Torah. Temple of Elohim just had a scroll commissioned and was completed not very long ago. No vowels. We don't touch the text because we don't want to get, you know, oils and stains on the text. So it's often read with a pointer called a yad, which means hand. And it is the most sacred object in Jewish tradition. The Mishnah, there are 6 sections of it. This is a collection of Mishnah with commentary. I have a, you know, if I were home, I would grab one of my books. I have an English translation of Mishnah, which is about 800 pages, you know, in fairly small English text. So the Mishnah is not small. It is really similar in scope to a Bible. And then here is, this is a page of Talmud. Again, we're going to have separate study on Talmud. So in here is the Mishnah and the Gemara. And then if something interesting comes up in the Mishnah and the Gemara, you're going to have different rabbis and schools commentating. I should say commenting. I'm not sure how commenting became commentating. That's an interesting question. Commenting on the text and explaining it. And you have Rashi is always on the inside. So this with the binding would be here. And you have things in the margins and, you know, and it's an ancient form of hypertext. You don't click on it and go to another place, but written in the margins are elements explaining the meaning of the text. Murray.
Would the Talmud, which is not the Torah, would the Talmud be considered like case law?
Yeah. So yes, you're actually getting at it.
Because you mentioned 800 pages of little English words. I mean,
well, that's Mishnah. Talmud is much bigger.
Wow,
Yeah, I'm going to show you a little bit of Talmud. So, so the Mishnah reads a lot like a constitution, a legal code, and Talmud reads a lot like case law. And we're actually going to see that a little bit. And then there's legal codes, and then there's something called responsa literature, which is actually case law. So here is a collection of Talmud, and these are not small books. These are like, you know, very, very large books. In a collection of Talmud, which I like to use, the Schottenstein collection, which is both the original Aramaic and an English translation, a full set of Talmud is 72 large volumes. So I often say that Talmud is equivalent to our New Testament. I'll say more about that, but it's much more complex than a Christian New Testament.
New one of those will cost you about $3,000 on Amazon.
Yes, a paper collection is about $3,000, and you can actually get a very nice collection of PDFs for about $400. And on Safaria, you have it all for nothing. Safari is free, and it's all there. I mean, it may not be quite the extensive commentary that you would like, but it is certainly there. So I want to give you an example of some things that are in Torah, Mishnah, and Gemara. So we have a commandment about the Sabbath, to keep it holy. 6 days you work, 7th day is a Sabbath. You don't work, your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor the stranger that was in your gates. Nobody works. Working is a full-time job 24/6. Nobody works on the Sabbath. So the question is, how do you define work? So I'm always curious as to what people will say. How would you define work? You may have to unmute yourself. Or even more importantly than how do you define work, the question is, how does God define work? So I often ask, do you think changing a baby's diaper is work?
No.
No. Anybody here think
It's
changing?
required for the comfort of the baby.
Okay. And also the health and safety of the baby.
Correct.
But even things that are good for health and safety that are work, you're allowed to do under Jewish law.
Mm-hmm.
But working on the Sabbath biblically is punishable by death. And there's almost no clarification in the Bible about what is work. There's a specific reference to not making a fire. And the Israelites, when they're wandering in the desert and they have manna, they gather up the manna every day, but not on Shabbat. They get a double portion on Friday, and that's actually one of the reasons why we have traditionally two challahs on Friday night to represent the double portion of manna.
So what about the cows? So what about the cows? You got to milk them every day. Otherwise, they're in terrible discomfort.
So is milking cow work?
But is milking a cow work? It's work for the dairyman.
Is leading a service work?
Well, not the way you do it.
I'm not sure how to take that.
That was a joke.
No. So you would think somewhere God would define work. And lo and behold, in the Mishnah, we have in Shabbat, appropriately enough, it says the primary classes of work are 40 less 1. And then we have a list of 39 major categories of work. And, it says writing 2 letters, and they don't mean one to mom and one to dad. They mean an aleph and a bet. Extinguishing a fire or lighting a fire is considered work. That's work. And then what's going to happen in the Talmud, remember this is Mishnah, is they are going to start dissecting every one of these elements. This is really applying to sort of early agricultural times, things like slaughtering a deer and flaying it and salting it and curing its hide and so on. So now for, Shabbat is an entire tractate, one of those books. They're going to discuss the details on this. So just to give you a flavor for what the details are, here is the Gemara, the opening of the Gemara on this subject. So the first question the Gemara is going to ask is, why state the number? It says 40 less 1. So first thing the Gemara is going to ask is, why do we need to state the number? If we're really interested in knowing how many primary labors there are, we can count. And again, the underlying assumption is that everything in the Torah, everything in sacred text, has deep meaning. So Rabbi Yochanan is going to say, to teach us, that if one performs them all in one state of unawareness, he's liable on account of each separately. And what he means by that is, let's say I wake up one morning and I've been really sick, I've been groggy, I'm not quite sure, even what day of the week it is. I go into the bathroom, I turn on the light, I look in the mirror, I look, awful. I take out my electric razor and I start shaving myself. I turn on the radio and I realize it's Saturday. So the question is, have I committed one sin or have I committed 3 sins? Turning on the light, turning on the razor, and turning on the radio. And the Gemara is teaching that I've had 3 sins, and I need to atone for each separately. That's not such a big deal these days, but in ancient times, you would have to bring 3 separate sacrifices to the temple. So the point is, even stating the number has deep meaning, and now you know why the Talmud is so enormous, because they're going to dig into everything. I want to get into the differences in the way Judaism and Christianity approach this, and it was even raised before. So again, biblical Judaism was an ancient religion which existed in temple times, and the text of biblical Judaism was the Hebrew Bible. And the way you related to God was by sacrificing animals, and you needed a priesthood. In the first century of the Common Era, there are 2 momentous occasions. One leads to Christianity and one leads to Rabbinic Judaism. So as we have been discussing on Rabbinic Judaism, the key event is the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. And now we have a religion which is based on a priesthood and an animal and a sacrificial system. And we're actually told in the book of Deuteronomy that the only place we're allowed to have the temple is in Jerusalem, and now the temple's destroyed. So what the heck do we do? And you can think of, the rabbis kind of scratching their heads and saying, so what do we do now? One answer is, well, the Romans defeated the Israelites. The Roman God must be more powerful than the Israelite God, so let's worship Roman gods. Another answer might be, well, let's just build a temple someplace else. And there's some archaeological evidence for temples that may have been built during this time period in other places. Another example is, hey, we know there are a bunch of Jews that are worshiping this faith healer and rabbi Jesus. Maybe that's the right path. And another answer is, let's reform Judaism. So where do the rabbis get the chutzpah to completely change Judaism? And they get it in our sacred myth. And we have, from time to time, lots of discussions about the idea of a sacred myth. So the idea that God gave us this oral law, which ultimately gets written down, I would say is a sacred myth. I have a sneaking suspicion that it probably doesn't really need to get developed until a temple is destroyed. And maybe it's as early as 586 BCE, when the temple is destroyed and you have the Jews exiled into Babylon, the Jews are faced with the question, how are we to be Jewish without a temple? And my guess is some of these ideas start developing at that time. And then with the ultimate destruction of the Second Temple, we really need a new form of Judaism. I would say a reform of Judaism, which is Rabbinic Judaism. And here what we're doing is we're reading the Hebrew Bible through the interpretive lens of the rabbis of the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Talmud. Bryce.
So it occurs to me, you just have had this this Jesus fella that had was basically, in a sense, trying to reform Judaism with the moneylenders in the temple and all this kind of stuff.
Jesus was a rabbinic Jew, was a Pharisee.
I understand that. So, so the point being, you've got this, the whole temple animal sacrifice industry that had developed by this point. The rabbis may have been looking at this and saying, this really is corrupting for us. And if we could find a reason to not do this anymore, it would be good for Judaism.
I never saw any evidence that the rabbis were opposed to the sacrificial system, because the rabbinic ideas preceded the destruction of the temple. And in fact, in the Talmud, there's a lot of discussion and specific plans about what to do if the Messiah comes and the temple is restored. But I think they may have had this under. There was a political battle between the rabbis and the priests, with the destruction of the temple, the priests became irrelevant because there was almost nothing for them to do. They still have, in traditional Judaism, some ceremonial things to do, but by and large, their priestly functions have disappeared, and Judaism becomes a rabbinic tradition. And Jesus really is preaching in the rabbinic tradition.
Exactly. And so it seems that this political battle would have become completely undone again if you had built another temple someplace else and found found justification somewhere in the
Yeah,
Torah.
so Judaism might have continued for some time as a sacrificial cult. So looking at the Christian side of the house, speaking of Jesus, the key event is the arrival of Jesus. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you hold that Jesus is not only Messiah, and we're going to talk about this in some detail, but also some sense God, and in some sense Redeemer of sin. And if this is your belief, the good old Hebrew Bible isn't sufficient. So you need new texts. And the new text is the New Testament. And the basic thing that's going on here is Christians are reading the Hebrew Bible through the interpretive lens of the New Testament and the church fathers. And the Jews are reading the Hebrew Bible through the interpretive lens of the rabbis of Talmudic times, of these times, and the Talmud. Same text, although a very interesting thing, and we'll get into this more when we go into this stuff in detail, the Jews who became Christian were reading their Bible in Greek. And the Greek translation has connotations that I think are very different than the Hebrew connotation for words like Torah and even Messiah. So that's going to have a great influence together. But I often compare this to the Supreme Court and the Constitution. We have one Constitution, and people can argue about, what elements of that Constitution means, the right to bear arms and so on. And courts will make different decisions. And ultimately, our form of government has the Supreme Court being the final arbiter of what the Constitution means. So for Jews, it's the rabbis and the Talmud. For Christians, it's the New Testament and the church fathers. Another important thing, again, relating to Torah, is the idea of mitzvah. And mitzvah means commandment. Many Jews, I would say most Jews, think of the word mitzvah as meaning a good deed, but it means commandment, and there are commandments that are clearly good deeds, such as feeding the hungry and giving to tzedakah and returning lost goods and paying a laborer at the end of the day. And there are mitzvot that are not good deeds. They're not bad, but what's good about lighting Shabbat candles? Preserves a tradition, but it doesn't help anybody other than the candle maker. But the Hebrew word mitzvah means commandment. And so, I'm sure you all know, you have a bar or bat mitzvah is someone who is obligated to observe commandments. A newborn baby isn't obligated to observe commandments. An adult is, therefore, in a religion that's really focused on what you're supposed to do, there must be a critical age at which you become obligated to obey commandments. In Jewish tradition, that age is 13 for boys and 12 for girls, because girls mature earlier than boys. And so I often point out, to great shock and surprise, when people come to me and they're Jewish and they say, I was never bar mitzvah and I was never bat mitzvah, I say to them, Mazel tov, you are. If you're Jewish, and you're 13 years old, you are bar mitzvah. It means you're obligated to obey commandments. You don't need any kind of ceremony to be bar mitzvah. What we do, of course, these days is we have the child do something that only an adult Jew is permitted to do, which is namely lead a service and read from the Torah. So he or she celebrates reaching the age of majority by doing something that only an adult Jew can do. It's kind of like a kid turning 21 and going to a bar and having a drink. The commandments are not just the Big Ten. Jews count 613 commandments in the Torah alone, and some that are not part of the Big Ten, with which you will be familiar, is love your neighbor, don't eat pork, paying wages to a day laborer each day. For these days, only about half of the commandments apply to us, because a lot of the commandments deal with how you sacrifice animals, and a lot of the commandments only apply in the land of Israel. So about half the commandments apply to us in these times. And as we'll see in a moment, the rabbis are going to get thousands of commandments more. Bryce, I don't know if your hand is still raised or you just didn't lower it.
I'll lower it now.
Okay, thank you. So again, this is just what I said, 613 in the Torah, but the rabbis of the Talmud add thousands more against mixing milk and meat. There are certain animals which are kosher. The Hebrew word kosher means fit or appropriate, but the rabbis are going to say it's not only about which animals, but how they are slaughtered if it's an animal. So a chicken is kosher, but there are kosher chickens, as you know, if you go shopping, and there are not kosher chickens. So it has to do with how they're slaughtered. Lighting Shabbat candles, bar and bat mitzvahs, Hanukkah candles, Passover seders, daily prayers. Almost this is another mega point. If you don't remember anything else, remember this. Almost everything that we do as Jews today have a root in the Bible, but the details and the flourishing, I'll say a seed in the Bible, but the flourishing of the garden is in the Talmud. So for example, the idea of people getting together to pray, which of course is a central idea, in rabbinic Judaism and Christianity and Islam and most religions, is not mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. There is not one single example in the Hebrew Bible of people getting together as a congregation to pray. There are a very few individual prayers, but no communal prayers. The idea of Rosh Hashanah as a new year is not in the Bible. The words Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, the way prayers are minted, is actually the term used in the Talmud, are organized, is nowhere in the Hebrew Bible. So virtually everything we do as Jews, we are doing in response to the Talmud. I find that almost no one knows this. Very few Jews know this, and virtually no non-Jews are aware of it. And so that's one of my goals, is to make sure that idea sticks with you. There are, as you know, different Jewish movements, and this is kind of a nutshell description of the meaning of the differences between the movements. So Orthodox Judaism teaches, I'm using the word teach because I'm not going to describe what Orthodox Jews and conservative Jews and Reform Jews do or believe. Orthodox Judaism teaches that all Jewish law is unchanging and binding on all Jews. So for example, you're not allowed to make a fire on the Sabbath. Along comes electricity. The rabbis think about electricity. It's well after Talmudic times. And they decide electricity is fire. So all the rules we have about fire, we're going to apply to electricity. So in a traditional Orthodox home, you don't start or stop an electrical current. So you don't turn light switches on and off. You don't turn a TV or a radio on and off. You shouldn't use a microphone. And it can get into great detail. Hasidic Judaism and Chabad are well-known examples of orthodoxy, but we'll get into,
Rabbi Barbara mentioned that they actually had people that would turn it on for them beforehand.
Yes, so that is a Shabbos goy, is the common expression. And it's actually a legal fiction. Because remember, in the commandment, it says, nobody works, not you, your manservant or your maidservant, your animals, nobody works. So how can I hire somebody to work on the Sabbath? And the answer is you can't. So how do they get around that? And this is going to make many of you annoyed or angry. And the answer is you don't. You give a guy $50 a week, and it just so happens he knows to turn on the lights and, you know, and clean the sanctuary after Friday night services to get it ready for Saturday, and you know, and take away the candles and do all the things that that needs to be done. But nowhere technically, it's a legal fiction. Nowhere technically are you actually hiring him to do work on the Sabbath, because you're not even allowed to have your animals work on the Sabbath. How much less so should you have another person work? And I should hasten to add that any law, any Jewish law, with 3 exceptions, can be violated. A Sabbath law, for example, can be violated to preserve human life or health. So in a hospital, you know, if a Jewish doctor is called to a hospital on the Sabbath, he must go or she must go, because of that, you know, presumably they wouldn't have called him unless no one else was available. So it's a matter of human life or health. And there's even rulings that he should take or she should take an elevator, because they would be in better shape to treat a patient rather than running up 8 flights of stairs. The 3 exceptions, by the way, are murder. If someone orders you to murder someone, you are to surrender your own life before being murdered. Sexual crimes such as rape or incest, you are to surrender your own life before committing. And public blasphemy. If someone requires you publicly to swear your allegiance to another religion, you are to surrender your life before doing so. So that's orthodoxy. Conservative Judaism teaches that all Jewish law is binding on all Jews, but the laws change with the times. Using what actually happens in the Talmud. I mean, we'll see, for the rabbis of the Talmud changed Jewish law. In the example I love to give, and it's one I have a slide on, is the example of an eye for an eye. 3 times in the Talmud, in the Torah, it says if somebody knocks out your eye, you should knock out their eye. The rabbis were very uncomfortable with this, so they change it. But they can't change it by saying, you know, things change with the time, so we're going to disregard this. They change it by proving that God didn't mean it, because it would lead to an unjust or illogical result. So they are able to change it that way. Conservative Judaism continues this process by saying all Jewish law is binding on all Jews, but the laws change with the times. And they are, I would say, less shy about changing laws, still using Talmudic logic to change the laws, but they will change laws that Orthodoxy never changed. So for example, in the conservative movement, it's okay to drive to the nearest synagogue on Shabbat, not necessarily your synagogue, but the nearest synagogue. The Reform world is hard to pin down. Here is my working definition. Ethical laws, laws that relate to how we treat one another, I would say animals and the environment, are binding on all Jews. But the ritual laws, do I keep my head covered all the time? Am I strictly kosher? Am I strictly Sabbath observant? Do I have a little mezuzah on every doorpost? Those laws should be studied, and each individual should decide if he or she hears God's voice in those laws. And I know people, including myself, that have tried following certain laws, sort of as a spiritual exercise, as an exercise in spiritual discipline. And in some cases, I find those paths, say keeping kosher, to be spiritually elevating. In other cases, I don't find them to be spiritually elevating. So that's a huge difference. And there is a liberal Orthodox rabbi named Yitz Greenberg who has a quote on this subject, which I love. And he says, "I don't care which movement you're affiliated with, so long as you're ashamed of it." And I think there are major problems with each of the Jewish movements. Okay, so let me move on. So I wanted to spend some time in the Taste of Judaism and Torah on the question of Jesus, on why Jews don't accept Jesus as Messiah, because it deals with a very important issue, which is really, what do Jews mean when we say the word Messiah? The issue isn't so much about Jesus and whether Jesus might have been the Messiah. The issue is the Jewish understanding of the meaning of Messiah is quite different than the Christian understanding, as we will see. So first, the Hebrew word Messiah is the English translation. The English word Messiah, is a translation of the Hebrew word Mashiach. Mashiach means one who is anointed. In biblical times, every king of Israel, when he attained his kingship, was anointed by having holy oil poured on their heads by either a prophet or a priest. When the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek about 200 years before the time of Jesus, the Hebrew word Mashiach becomes the Greek word Christos. And I think I mentioned, I know somebody was remarking that they learned that the word Christos begins with the Greek letter chi, which looks like an X. So when we see Xmas for Christmas, they're just using the word chi, the letter chi. So a Jewish translation translates the Hebrew word Mashiach into the Greek word Christos, and the Greek word Christos gives rise to the English word Christ. So when I talk about Jesus, and I do talk about Jesus a lot, I think a week from this Saturday, I'm going to be teaching Catholic deacons in training about Judaism. I'm very careful never to refer to Jesus as Christ, or say Jesus Christ as though Christ is Jesus' second name, unless I'm making a particular theological point, such as for Christianity, Jesus is the Christ. And I think that's a discipline Jews ought to take on for themselves. Perfectly okay to talk about Jesus. We should not refer to Jesus as Christ. Robin. Unmute yourself, Robin.
What is the name that we call the person who oversees a kosher kitchen and says that the kitchen is indeed kosher and the meat is all kosher?
Yeah, it's a mashgiach, and it has
A
nothing
mashgiach. I know it was something similar to Mashiach.
Yeah, and it has nothing to do with Mashiach. Good question. So Judaism has lots of understandings about Messiah, and they vary all over the place, but they all agree on a few things. First, that the Jewish understanding of Messiah is the Messiah is fully human and only human. A political or military ruler like King David, who is certainly anointed. Not God in any sense, or not the Son of God in any sense beyond the idea that we are all children of God. The Jewish understanding of Messiah is not at all connected with redemption of sin. We're entering the high holidays in 2 weeks. Only we can atone for our own sins. And as is repeated over and over again during the high holidays, for sins against God, God is forgiving. And if we're sincere in asking God for forgiveness and sincere in our repentance and successful in the non-repetition of the sin, we believe that God is forgiving. An important difference between Judaism and Christianity is we are taught that for sins against other people, God cannot forgive such a sin unless the person offended forgives the sin. And so Messiah certainly is not connected with this in Judaism. And as I think most of you who are Jewish know, Messiah is not at all at the heart of Judaism. I would say it is true that I almost never talk about Messiah to Jews unless I'm explaining the difference between Jewish understandings of Messiah and Christian ones. Bryce.
So for sins against others, God cannot forgive unless the person offended forgives.
Yes.
Do you mean will not? Because unless you mean to place a limit on God's power.
I don't think it's a question of power. I think it's an understanding of sin. And also another element that I'm not really getting into is for Jews, sin is like an accounting mechanism. There are no mortal sins. There are no, we don't talk about a state of sin. The understanding in Judaism is we each have good deeds and bad deeds, and God judges us. So you may have a lot of sins, but you also have a lot of good deeds, and ultimately God is the righteous judge. So I think for Jews to adopt the position that God can forgive any sin would then take away the necessity of asking people for forgiveness. Now, whether you're ultimately going to be punished or what the punishment is, that's one of these God knows questions. But the idea in Judaism is a hyper responsibility on people dealing with one another for the sins against one another. And by the way, there's a rule there's an understanding that if you ask sincerely 3 times, and you also restore the consequences of the sin. So if the sin was, you stole someone's camera, you restore their camera. You have to do that, and then you have to ask. And if you do it sincerely 3 times, you have discharged your duty. So I would say that's the Jewish understanding, and I don't think that
I can think of many social and relationship sins that cannot be restored. So like for instance, let's say a man cheats on his wife. Okay, so how can
okay, so hold on. So if a man cheats on his wife, he can ask her forgiveness. I mean, he can't necessarily undo.
Exactly, that's my point. You
yeah,
can't,
but forgiveness doesn't mean the sin is forgotten, and it doesn't mean the sin is undone. What it means is the sin is forgiven. So if I slander someone, I can ask for forgiveness and publicly apologize, and as much as possible try and undo the consequences of the sin. Slander and gossip are considered to be particularly offensive sins because they're very difficult to undo. And in many cases, you insulted somebody when you were 14 years old, in high school or junior high school, and you've completely lost touch with them, so you can't undo it because you couldn't find them if you wanted to. And by the way, murder becomes definitionally unforgivable because the person you murdered can't forgive you. And again, Messiah is not at the heart of Judaism. There are lots of different Jewish prophecies concerning the Messiah. They all agree on the idea of a time of peace on earth, peace among people, people beating swords into plowshares, all the world coming to know the one God, not everyone being Jewish, but everyone knowing the God of Abraham. The details are unresolved. The mystics see it as a supernatural time, resurrection of the dead, and all kinds of amazing things. And the rationalists believe we will do the work to make the world better, even perfect, and the Messiah will come along to say Mazel Tov. And I would say Reform broadly espouses the idea of a messianic age rather than an individual Messiah. So here's my handy dandy Has the Messiah Come test. Read the LA Times cover to cover every day for a month. If there's no story of war, hatred, hunger, or disease, the Messianic age may be here, but that doesn't seem like it's happened. Why don't Jews accept Jesus as the Messiah? Question I get asked a lot. Question you may get asked a lot. And here's the answer. The simplest one is no world peace, no Messiah. Christians understand this, so they talk about Jesus coming a second time. In Greek, it's called parnusa. It's a second coming. And it's a fine idea. It's just not Jewish. But the larger idea is not whether Jesus is the Messiah, it's whether Jesus is God. The idea of God taking human form, suffering with us, and dying for our sins is beautiful and inspiring, but it's not Jewish. That's why I have great respect for Christianity as a separate religion and system of beliefs, which I think leads to a lot of good in the world. But I have less respect for Jews for Jesus or Messianic Jews, because they are basically saying, what's the big deal? Some Jews are waiting for a Messiah. We think the Jewish Messiah has come and his name was Jesus. What's the big deal? The big deal is not who is Jesus, but who is God. Big deal is, are you led to focus on what you do in Jewish law rather than just proper faith? There's a lot of sort of random stuff which I'm going to fly through. And if there's, again, this will be covered in much greater detail in the literacy class. Our calendar is an interesting one. It's lunisolar. Each month begins on a new moon. And so if you count up 12 lunar months, you get 355 days. So you're 11 days short of a solar year. And in fact, in the Muslim calendar, which is also a lunar calendar, that's what they do, and they don't make any adjustments. So every Muslim holiday tied to the Muslim calendar occurs 11 days earlier every year. But because the Torah says you have to have Passover in the spring, we have to somehow adjust our calendars to keep Passover in the spring. So we add an extra month, the second Adar Sheni, Adar 2, 7 times in a 19-year cycle in these years. And Rosh Chodesh is a holiday which occurs on the first day of every month, minor holiday. Here are sort of the major holidays: Rosh Hashanah, the new year coming up. Oh, by the way, so when we add these months, when you add another month, all of the holidays will come later in the year. People are often asking, why is Hanukkah so late this year? And my snarky answer is Hanukkah is the same day it is every year. It's the 25th day of Kislev. The English calendar, the Gregorian calendar is early. But that's the reason, because we're adding leap months rather than just a leap day. So we have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Pesach, Shavuot, Hanukkah, Purim, Simchat Torah, and Tisha B'Av. In the Jewish literacy class, we will be spending time on each of these. This is kind of a chart of when they occur. I think I'm not going to belabor the individual holidays. In the text that I recommended, you'll find a lot more discussion of the holidays. Coming up on Rosh Hashanah, with traditional blowing of the shofar and milk and honey, and honey and apples representing a sweet year. Atonement, this is Yom Kippur, which is mentioned in the Bible, and the high priest transmitting the sins of Israel onto 2 goats, one who gets sacrificed and one who gets sent off. Hanukkah, holiday of lights. Purim, it's kind of like the Jewish Halloween, people dress up and so on. So I'm going to fly through a bunch of texts just to let you know that they're in the presentation and on the website. The central text, central statement of faith of Judaism is the Shema, proclaiming the oneness or the uniqueness of God, and goes on to talk about loving God and mentioning these instructions regularly when you lie down and when you rise up, leading to the tradition of reciting the Shema in the morning and the evening, binding them as a sign upon your hand and a symbol before your eyes, resulting in the tradition of these little things called tefillin in the Hebrew, phylacteries in English, with these words in a box that you traditional Jews pray with on their head and on their arm. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, leading to a mezuzah. Inside the mezuzah, on doorpost, are these words. About a prayer shawl. It's one of the few, I would say, commandments in the Bible which are explained. It says, when you wear a garment with 4 corners, you should attach tzitzit, translation, or the Hebrew is for fringes, to each corner. And it says, that shall be your fringe. Look at it and recall the commandments of Adonai and observe them. So it's kind of like tying a string around your finger. It's a reminder to obey the commandments. And as we'll see when we get into some of this material in depth, the fringes are tied in a very unique way to remind us of the commandments. And this is a kind of a little bit of a flavor on the kinds of things you see in the Talmud. When the Talmud is commenting on specific texts from the Bible. So in Deuteronomy, it says, follow none but the Lord your God. So the Talmud is going to ask the question, how can a human being actually follow the ways of God? What does it mean that we should imitate the ways of God? And it will go into it. It says, as it's written, God made clothing for Adam and his wife, so you should clothe the naked. As God visited the sick, God visits Abraham right after circumcision, so you should visit the sick. As God comforts mourners, so you should comfort the mourners. And as God buries the dead, God buries Moses, so you should bury the dead. In the Mishnah, we have some very famous statements from Hillel, being quoted as saying, if I'm not for myself, who is both for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Milk and meat, the only thing it says in the Torah is don't boil a baby goat in its own mother's milk. And it says it 3 times. And there's no explanation for this. I've come across some scholarly teachings that suggest that it may have been a Canaanite kind of a magical worship ritual. And there's a lot in the Torah about not following Canaanite rituals and, and idol worship traditions. And the rabbis then go on and give all the rules about not eating milk with meat, having separate sets of dishes, waiting 6 hours after you eat meat before you eat milk. And I don't know if there's one principle which says they're making a fence around the Torah. If you never have any meat with any milk, you will never accidentally boil a kid in its own mother's milk. That's reaching a bit because you're not supposed to eat chicken either, and you can't boil a chicken in its own mother's milk. But people also speculate that the rabbis were espousing a principle that whenever you eat meat, you are encountering death. An animal has been slaughtered to produce meat. Milk is the essence of life, and there's a lot in Judaism about keeping things separate. And here's some midrash, which is this one I particularly like. It was taught in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua, the poor person standing at the door does more for the householder than the householder does for the poor person. The assumption here is that the householder is giving the poor person some tzedakah, some funds, and the principle is the householder is actually getting more out of it than the poor person because the householder is fulfilling a mitzvah. More text, a Hasidic saying, so this goes beyond a midrash and so on. And I like this too. It says, one should always have 2 slips of paper carrying with you at all time. On one should be written, the whole world has been created only for my sake. And the other one would be, I am but dust and ashes. So when you're feeling too uppity, remind yourself that you're dust and ashes. And when you're really feeling depressed, embrace this idea that God created the universe for you. And speaking of that, in the Talmud, this is again one of my favorites. There are actually 7 questions. So we'll talk about that maybe. I have a sermon on this subject on my website. Jewish tradition talks about 7 questions that we will be asked by the Holy One in the next life. And one of them is the question, why didn't you partake in the various permitted pleasures of life? And I love that idea. It's kind of like God has laid out this smorgasbord of pleasure for us. Beautiful places to hike, great foods to eat, relationships with people, sexuality, art, music, and so on. And God really wants us to enjoy them. There was never a major element in Judaism of asceticism, of denial of pleasures. And the implication is God is not going to be so happy if we don't partake in all of them. There's a wonderful story about the head of yeshiva in probably in the 1700s, 1800s, in the old country. And one day he gets up and he says, boys, well, he says it with a Yiddish accent, I'm sure, but I'm sure in Yiddish. He said, we're going to hike the Alps. And his students are shocked. The rabbi is someone who spends all of his day immersed in sacred text. What does hiking have to do with anything? And so they asked him why, and he said, it just occurred to me that when I meet God and God asks me, "Nu, so what did you think of my Alps?" What am I going to say? So it's kind of like having a bucket list. Some of you may be familiar with Maimonides listing a hierarchy of tzedakah, of giving. At the lowest end, giving grudgingly or reluctantly or with regret, then giving less than you should, but with grace, giving what you should, but only after being asked, give before you're asked, then higher than that, giving without knowing who will receive it, although the recipient knows the identity of a giver, to give without making known one's identity, to give so that neither the giver nor the receiver knows the identity of the giver. That would be like, the United Way or something. And the highest form is to help another become self-supporting by means of a gift, a loan, or finding employment for one in need. And that covers what I wanted to cover. So we have a few minutes if there are any questions, comments. David, I don't know if you're saying, yeah.
It's me, Deb.
Oh, hi.
Can you repeat the couple of sentences you said again about why we should not say Christ as?
Yeah, because, yes. The English word Christ comes from the Greek word Christos, which means Messiah.
Oh, okay.
So by describing Jesus as Christ or saying Jesus Christ, unless you hit yourself with your thumb, my father, who is as Jewish as you can get, would always, when he got angry, he said Jesus Christ. And I have that unfortunate tendency also. I often would say to bar and bat mitzvah kids, there's only two major things that can go wrong during the bar or bat mitzvah. Major thing number one is you drop the Torah. And there's a tradition about fasting for 30 days, daytime fast, and so on. It's terrible. Major thing beyond that is if you drop the Torah and I scream Jesus Christ, then not only am I fasting, but I'm unemployed. Robin, you have your hand up?
Yes, I heard Milton Berle tell a very funny joke yesterday. He said his wife was very sexually imbibed and they had sex almost every night. Almost Monday, almost Tuesday, almost Wednesday.
Okay, unfortunately, that's now in the recording for the rest of time. You and me. So that's a great place to end the recording, and maybe even a reminder to end.